Hello. Hi, so my name is Alex Holacek, and I work doing metadata curation for the ADS. I actually don't have any formal training as a librarian. I was a Russian history major in college, and I'm telling you this because the stuff I'm doing is sort of intermediate Python level, and you don't really have to have a background as a computer scientist or a mathematician for that matter to use like kind of some really powerful tools with Python and even some basic machine learning. So hopefully I'll kind of show you some interesting things. So my presentation, I kind of made it more as an interactive website than a presentation. So if you want to see it maybe later, I hyperlink to a lot of resources that I found helpful. So you can find it here. All right, so I started out, I wanted to look at the popularity of different specialties in the ADS. So the ADS, as we kind of already went over, is a search engine for astrophysics documents. And so our first task was we were assigned to relate New York Times articles in the astronomy and astrophysics section, which is a great sort of popular telling of like current research in astronomy. And our first task was to associate those, find some way to automate associating those articles with research articles in the ADS. And so this presented like some interesting issues, like what would you call a direct relationship between the articles. And the first thing we noticed is that New York Times is helpfully sometimes puts direct links from the New York Times article to the science website that published the article. So either Science or Nature, sometimes they have a direct hyperlink. So first I'll go over, I guess, the key lessons that we learned from this one. And to be more broad, so first we're going to look at using screen scraping to gather information that you can't get from an API. Then we're going to get a little bit more, I guess, advanced and use some regular expressions and natural language processing, which I think if you're a librarian, learning a bit of Python and a bit of regex and some natural language is like, it's incredibly useful and very powerful. And then we're going to look at using this D3, this JavaScript D3 library for visualization. And then finally, using a naive Bayes classifier, and that's a little bit more getting into like really basic statistics to analyze what terms correlated with high citation articles and what terms in the ADS correlate with low citation articles. So the first thing to do was screen scraping, to try to automate tying together what's being written in the New York Times with ADS articles. So the lessons that I learned here is that learning how to work with an API is super useful, and it's not as difficult as it originally appears. And an API, if you don't know, I didn't know like 3 months ago, it means application programming interface, and it's basically just a way to automate grabbing information from different resources. And Python has a module to make it easy. So you always want to go first to use an API if possible, but sometimes APIs are limited. So we found with the New York Times, their API didn't offer full text search, and also it didn't offer an account of the links that were directly in the article. So we wanted to do screen scraping instead. So screen scraping is a good second option if you can't use the API. And basically what screen scraping is it's accessing a website as if you are a person, but you're automating it, so you're writing like a bot to do it. And Python has a really great library for this called Scrapy or Scrapy. And this is a little bit more advanced. You need to be kind of like intermediate level to use it. But basically what a spider is you can write, you write a Python script that has rules for like how to access the website pages. So your rules could be like follow certain links, and then grab certain text from those pages, and then follow links on those pages, and so on. So you can aggregate a lot of information, and it's obviously way faster than if you were trying to do it by hand. The third thing is that really, as you're learning basic Python, and I link here to a great book called Think Python, that's like the absolute best resource. It's free online. The next thing to do, and maybe you already you know these formats, but they were new to me. CSV files, JSON data structures, XML, and then basic Python data structures. They're like the key sort of containers for the data you'll be working with. And if you can manipulate them, even at a pretty basic level, you can do some very cool things. Okay, so I'll kind of move on. The spider was interesting to write. It ended up that the New York Times, there were only about 200 articles in the body of articles we were looking at. And of those articles, only about, I think, 30 had direct hyperlinks to like the article's webpage in Nature or Science or astronomical journal. So if the links were there, the spider could catch them. And then it just spit everything out in this nice CSV document. So I have the bib code that the spider grabbed, the New York Times article title, the archive ID if it could find it, the DOI, and then the bib code is actually ADS's version of a DOI. So that was like kind of interesting, but it was there wasn't much further to go with that other than the fact that you can do it. So there were a lot of papers. So there were only 30 papers that had a direct link. So what about maybe like the 70 other papers that didn't have any direct hyperlink? It turns out that they had enough keywords and enough mentions of authors and other kind of helpful language that you could automate search queries to the ADS API and produce oftentimes some good matches for papers in the ADS API. So for this task was more difficult and took more time. But the thing that I really realized is that regular expressions, and here's the guide to the Python version of regular expressions, and natural language processing. Python also has a great module for that. It's just super useful if you're going to be working with data in any capacity. And you don't have to do it at a very high level. Even just being able to tokenize words and get rid of punctuation and standardize things can make a lot of analysis tasks much easier. Yeah. So if you don't know what regular expressions are, it's basically just pattern matching in different text. So what I did here is, okay, so here's an example of script output, the script that I wrote. This is actually an article that did have a link, and I wanted to see what other articles it suggested based on this link. So what the script does is, you can, if you want to read about it, it's on the website. But just briefly, it captures using, NLTK has this Python module has this great thing that is called named entity recognition, so it can catch what it thinks are proper nouns in the text. So I use that to catch likely names, and as you can see, for the astronomers, it got most of the astronomer names. It also got the last name of a journal article, so it's not perfect. It caught some bib stems, which is the ADS way of identifying journals. And this was just using regular expressions and matching from a list of journals that I was interested in. It also, I saw the pattern that astronomical objects frequently had 2 capital letters followed by some numbers, so it caught anything it thought might be an astronomical object. And then looked for frequent words and frequent bigrams. And a bigram is, I didn't know what this was before I started this class, but it's 2 word pairs. So oftentimes this is much more useful than single words. And so actually this script ended up being like surprisingly useful, and it most of the time it would capture articles that were in some way associated with, or papers that were associated with the articles. And yeah, so as you can see, this article is about a controversy about whether a planet is habitable, and so it catches like false alarm, habitable zone, and the name of the planet. Okay, so these 2 didn't have like really amazing outputs. They were good exercises, but then the next 2 things that I did, I think, maybe were a little more advanced and produced something that was a little more interesting to see. So, so what I did here is, so basically Katie in our class administers this thing called the Unified Astronomy Thesaurus. And here's a screenshot. And what it does, it's very cool. It has kind of a nested structure describing different astronomical objects and their interrelationships. So it shows you the parent terms, the children terms, some of the sibling terms, and also it's useful if you're doing data analysis. It has some synonyms. So if you want to do like frequency analysis, you're counting all of these and the word near-Earth objects as instances of near-Earth objects. So I ended up combining this nested structure with just counting word frequencies in highly cited articles in the ADS to make this thing that I'll get to in a second, which is an interactive kind of exploration of word frequencies. So that's one thing I realized, is that you can do a lot of cool things just by combining 2 sources of data that haven't been combined before, maybe. It's it's easier if someone has already done some of the work for you, because otherwise you'd have to maybe like do all of these relationships by hand, which would be a formidable task. And also, so this task took me a really long time, and the thing that took me the most time was like the least interesting, which was I had a flat XML file that identified these parent-child relationships of terms, and I had to turn that into a nested JSON structure, and that took forever. So it wasn't like, it wasn't fun at all. It was just frustrating. But I think like just realizing that there will be a lot of frustrating stuff, but you're learning stuff even when it's really frustrating, and hopefully I luckily had some programmers in the office next to me so they could help me out, and hopefully you can find like a mentor who maybe knows a little bit more about some of this stuff. But yeah, but again, so for this project, I used Python dictionaries, lists, and JSON and XML. So I had to learn how to query XML, and I had to learn how to work with JSON, and those were like really key tasks. Okay, and the last thing is that visualization is obviously like the most fun and interesting part in the way that you can communicate what you've been doing to other people. So I use d3.js, which is like this JavaScript library for visualization, but it's definitely, I think, like the most difficult option. So I also like Google Charts. It's like a little bit more user-friendly. And we talked about R and Tableau. Okay, so I looked, just to review, I looked at word frequencies in this aggregate bunch of abstracts and titles from the top 200 articles from each year since 1980. So the way you do this is it kind of shows you relative frequencies of these. You can play with it if you have it on. You can get it on your phone maybe, but so it's fun to do. So like maybe you can do some like very basic analysis. So like maybe you want to know what's the most popular planet in the ADS. So you would go to the solar system, and then you'd look at solar system planets. And then you'd see, okay, so the outer planets are a little more popular than the inner planets. Okay, and so for the outer planets, Jupiter was mentioned the most times. So it was mentioned about like 109 times. And then compared to the inner planets, Mars was mentioned a little bit more. So if you're, I don't know much about astronomy, but if you're an astronomer, maybe this would be interesting to like, and some of the nested structures go on quite long, so they go to quite fine level of specificity. So I think if that's your subfield or something and you want to see who's talking about what, it might be kind of interesting. So this was just kind of searching for code on the internet that I thought was cool and then changing it to suit my needs. Right. Okay, and so if you want to see the code on GitHub, it's here. I don't know if you want to see it, but okay, so the final thing that I did was use this thing called a naive Bayes classifier to look at high citation articles and low citation articles, and see. I wanted to see, like, this was kind of a ridiculous idea, but I thought maybe you can find some trends that are always correlated with high citation papers or low citation papers. Like maybe, and people were joking that like you could find the things that were most predictive of high citation papers and then just write some perfect ideal paper that would be high citation. But this probably doesn't predict that to that extent, because I was looking at mostly stuff in the aggregate, so this was definitely not perfect. And I'll get into later like what I probably could have done better in this project. So the things that I learned is that even though I'm not like a big statistics person, learning really basic statistics is very helpful, and then you can even branch into basic machine learning. This is a really good book I've linked to here, to sort of figure out what's going on with your data, just basic frequencies and averages and things like that. It doesn't have to be super complicated. And then obviously I don't have a great knowledge either of bibliometrics or astronomy, so I did some things that I realized if I had known more about these fields, I would have adjusted more. But I think I did, as I went along, I realized, like, if I saw some strange data, it would alert me to the fact that maybe there was something I should correct for. And I think that's another lesson that I learned, is that as you're going, kind of constantly be aware of what is being produced and whether that's what you expect, and adjust. And sometimes you have to get rid of some things that maybe you don't know if you should get rid of, but for the results, you have to make some judgment calls sometimes, even though this seems like it should be this clean process. And so the final thing I want to say is text encoding, is like learning a little bit about ASCII and Unicode and UTF-8. This was, I think, a lot of people in the class were very frustrated, including me, for a long time, not understanding these things, and they cause these hideous errors that are just really annoying. So if you kind of know what's going on, you can at least not freak out when you see these odd, like, dashes and letters. going on your screen, and you can get rid of some of the frustration. Okay, so basically what I did is a Bayes classifier looks at relative frequencies in order to predict whether something belongs to a certain number of categories. So a Bayes classifier looks at prior probabilities, but I got rid of that part of the Bayes classifier. So I just fed it 50% high citation papers and 50% low citation papers. And I got those, I can explain more how I got them, but I tried to get a random sample of low citation papers after getting rid of things that you know would be low citation, like most PhD theses and conference papers, and other things that are not strict astronomical papers. Okay, so, and then the code gets kind of interesting because you can sort on basically a lot of different facets. So if you want to see which author is most likely, oh here, so I have some example queries that I did using the code. And take these with a grain of salt because, like, for instance, I didn't control for number of authors per paper. But I asked, among papers mentioning dark matter, which author is most predictive of high citation? So it turns out it's Volker Springel at the Max Planck Institute. I asked from 1960 to 1980 which title words were most indicative of a high or low citation paper. It turns out comet, ionospheric, and moon correlated with low citation papers, and systems, evolution, cluster, and massive correlated with high citation papers, which sort of makes sense. They seem a bit related. And then since 2000, the words NASA and GCS were quite correlated with high citation papers about stars. Okay, so you can kind of customize this code. Of course, the Bayes, and I think a lot of machine learning depends on a really large data set to make sense. So as you shrink your data set, it becomes more and more eccentric, and you risk like overfitting to your data. So you have to be really conscious of whether that's going on. But so the last thing that I'm going to show you is I made these two bubble charts to show which words were correlated from, I think, 1980, which words are correlated in the title and which bigrams in the abstract are correlated with low and high citation papers. So this is just looking at all low and high citation papers in the ADS without filter. And the results were pretty interesting. Some of the stuff was like you would expect. So the only thing that correlated directly with low citation results was preliminary results. Yeah, low citation papers. And then like some words like data release, or some bigrams like data release. I think excellent agreement also. So some of these kind of terms, these associated with high citation. And then also there were a lot of astronomical terms. And then people who know more about this field than I do tell me that a lot of these kind of make sense. So that's a good sign. Here's excellent agreement. Yeah, and so this can kind of just show you over the course of the past 20 years which subjects have tended to be more highly cited. So this was from the abstracts, and this is just from the titles, which has a little more low citation. So one thing that I thought was interesting but expected was that survey and catalog tended to be high citation. So if something is a catalog, it will tend to be more highly cited. Like estimation, more words about individual studies tended to be correlated with lower citation papers. Yeah, and then comment again is correlated with low citation. So that's pretty much my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, you had a question?
Yes, Alberto?
First of all, very impressive. Nice. Did you consider using keywords rather than abstract words? And if not, why
That's a
didn't
great
you?
question.
Yeah, okay.
So I used keywords, and then initially I used keywords because I thought that would be the quickest way to not have to tokenize words from the abstract and just get directly to the keywords. But I realized that actually Edwin explained to me that keywords were being ingested from multiple sources, so there were repeated keywords and keywords that were like slightly different, too different to really combine based on like just doing NLTK to make them all the same case and without punctuation, but different enough that, yeah, but essentially the same keyword. So since we didn't have like one standardized keyword system, it created some very interesting, ultimately wrong results. But yes.
Hi. This is fascinating, but I also wonder whether it will be helpful to actually, because the word that's highly correlated with highly cited paper, the trend may change, the topic would evolve. I was wondering whether there's a certain way to segment the time period. So for instance, decade, use them to divide and see whether there's a change in terms of high frequent, what word would be a good indicator of high citation and what would.
Yeah, I definitely think you're right. And so here I did between 1960 and 1980, and in the code you can easily segment it. The only problem I ran into is as you went farther back in time, the results got a little bit weirder, just maybe because it wasn't as standardized. So past 1960, you couldn't do so much comparison. But yeah, it was interesting to see, and yeah, you could definitely do that. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Does NLTK have a stemming system?
Yeah, I did. It has a Porter stemmer, so
Okay.
that's what I use.
I noticed in some of the bubble charts there are terms that are different only by the plural or presence or absence of plural. It might be interesting that if a plural form of a word is more correlated. So it's an interesting analysis whether you stem the terms or not. But in general, I think it seems to make sense that you would want to stem a lot of this stuff, at least if you're pulling raw title words or raw abstract words or bigrams or trigrams or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely noticed some repetition. I got CMB, which was cosmic microwave background, and the words cosmic microwave background were
Right.
both highly correlated. So yeah, so definitely there's many things you could do to make this better. Yes.
I had a question about the other one that you showed us using the Unified Astronomy Thesaurus.
Mm-hmm.
How did you do that? Are all the articles indexed with UAT terms?
So yeah, I just got in a really big text file. I got all the text I wanted to count, and then what I did was make one Python dictionary that had each synonym term correlated to its preferred term. So all these different terms, and you would use this one term. And then I made a list of the longest terms, a list of all of the terms, including the synonym terms, from longest to shortest. So then I searched for those terms, and then if I found that term, I would get rid of it so that it wouldn't also match the shorter version of the term. And then I'd count that, I'd use the dictionary to count that as an example of the preferred term. And then I would just tally it.
Oh, great. So that was using the full text.
Mm-hmm. Or no, that was using abstracts plus titles.
Okay.
Using the full text might be more interesting. But I think it's harder because a lot of it isn't easily accessible, at least through the API.
We can ask more questions later, but we can move on to the next group, the grants group. These people try and just take it out. I know, it's on.
So good evening. We just wanted to talk a little bit about our group's work, which focused on correlating grants from funding agencies with papers in the ADS. And the first thing we wanted to stress to start off was this. Basically that none of us had anything special that let us succeed at this or be able to do this, coming in straight off the bat. You can see we came in with a variety of experience levels. Perhaps the most important thing to note is that none of us specifically had experience really working with Python or with APIs before this. So on starting the project, we had a few initial goals. One, to find the sources for the grants, the funding agencies that supplied them, and some way to identify the grants from these agencies. then create a Python script that would search for matches between these grant identifier numbers, search the ADS for those to find where they occur, and finally to get the results of those queries into a format that was easy to use for analysis, a CSV file in our case. So as so many projects do, it started with some great brainstorming. This is just a selection from a Google Doc where we were noting links and notes and how do we find this stuff and where are we looking. We had this fantastic whiteboard diagram that we did for the associate. And this led us to a sort of general, more formal plan of action on how to proceed, going from funding agencies to grant numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, we're on to the coding, which I will let Christine do. And I will give her this microphone.
All right. So we were sifting about for data to create queries with, and but meanwhile we were learning Python. As Chris mentioned, that's what we dived into first. We learned a lot from working through the Natural Language Toolkit book. Rahul Dave came in and talked to us a lot about Python and worked us through some exercises. And so we started manipulating the grant data that we'd gotten from the web. And we were just generally trying to write code that did what we thought we were asking it to do. So that was really like we had some initial goals in that flowchart, but essentially we were like, maybe we can write some code and maybe it will return the thing that we think it means. And so as you can see, we were just taking like blocks of text because we were working with sites that were not scrapable. The federal government does not love APIs and things like that. There were like the NASA site was just like this giant thing with JavaScript clickable things that anyway. So we started out with some CSVs and then we started saying, well, how do we isolate useful search terms in these CSVs and then create queries? So we extracted values from the grant data and we were mostly working with NASA and Department of Energy grants, which came with grant numbers, names of authors, locations, lots of data. And so we built URLs and we looked at Python modules that seemed to be helpful. Various speakers came in and talked about things that they used, like Sunlight Labs, scrapelib, and things like that. And we looked at urllib and requests and things like that. We mostly ended up using requests a lot. So we tried a lot of, what am I on? Sorry. Okay. There we are. So we tried a lot of different approaches, and some of them were needlessly elaborate and slow, and some of them were slightly less awful. At one point, I had written a Python script that queried ADS once for every grant number, and then again for every bibcode that matched the grant number, and with the necessary delays that we built into the script to prevent us from getting our API keys revoked. This was a really massively slow and inefficient process. And so here's some very ugly code with like beautiful errors down here. So we slowly got to a point where we could we could think about goals beyond a mere lack of error messages. Instead of creating a long repetitive series of like of repetitive functions like pulling data and appending it to a row of data and then encoding it in a way that the other modules could use. So we eventually figured out how to handle the different types of data that the API was throwing at us because it throws out strings, numbers, lists. And we wrote functions to get them into a shape that the ASCII encoding and CSV writing functions wanted to see. So once we started having functions instead of long strings of stuff, that made debugging a little bit easier. And this is, I'd like to emphasize this is all embarrassingly basic stuff. Rahul is probably cringing over here. So one of the really embarrassingly basic things that I struggled with initially was just parsing learning to parse the dictionaries and arrays that in JSON. This is an example of what the ADS API shows you when you give it a query. It actually comes out as one long string. We were using a browser plugin called JSON View to make it nice and structured looking. So as we changed what we were asking the API for, we used fewer API calls, and it was less terrible. And we also realized a lot later than I care to admit that sometimes we were getting the wrong answer from the API because we were asking the wrong question. For example, the NASA grant numbers are a distinct string of letters and numbers. So they return pretty great results, but the Department of Energy numbers are in 2 parts separated by a hyphen. And it turns out that ADS sees the string as 2 search terms and does an OR search by default, such that we get results for the number, which is usually helpful, and we get results for DE, which it turns out is inside of a lot of people's names. So we got lots of results, lots and lots of results. So when we were dealing with names intentionally, as well as other data that wasn't simple, all caps, all ASCII text, we ran into a problem that the CSV module we were using to write our data into files wants to write it in ASCII characters. And so this was tricky. We experimented with a lot of different options for replacing Unicode characters, and in hopes of finding a way of restoring the Unicode characters later on. We didn't quite get there. That's something that we're still sort of working out. I mean, we got results, but there's a lot more we could do with the data if we didn't lose diacritics from everybody's names or from places. I should mention first that the screenshot that you see here, as you may have figured out, isn't our own code. This is from Stack Overflow. We learned, I knew about Stack Overflow before this class, but we found ourselves really leaning heavily on it. It turns out that, so it's a site where people ask questions about coding and they get answers back. If you've done any coding, you probably know all about this. One thing that was great about this is that we, besides often getting useful answers to our problems, was also that our rookie mistakes that we were making were not special, unique mistakes, which was very nearly reassuring. So a bunch of other stuff happened. So computers crashed. We wrote scripts to fix the output of our other scripts. The API took a vacation on its birthday. Learning to code hurts. At one point, I mentioned to someone I knew who gets paid to do web development, my frustrations, and he said, "It sounds like you're learning how to program." And I took that as encouragement.
So while we were really happy, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
While we were really happy about learning all of these cool tools and things, we were also dealing with a really steep learning curve because, as we mentioned, none of us have experience with much of this. We spent a lot of time searching for how to do things, and as she mentioned, Stack Overflow was a godsend, especially when we were trying to decipher Python error messages. So in addition to these tools, we talked about but didn't use R, SQL, and some other scraping libraries for Python. So through sheer determination and not insignificant luck, we went back and forth between scripts and results, modifying, trying to look closely at what we got back, seeing if that's what we were really asking. We finally managed to ask the right question in the right way and get a satisfying answer. And it was a pretty big answer that then we had to manipulate in order to even see. We quickly learned more about size and processing time limitations for Excel and OpenRefine. So now we had spreadsheets, we had data, and that was our goal, and we were happy. But part of our daily work as librarians is not just getting information, but also communicating it in an effective way. So we're at the point where we have enough data that we could, in enough right columns, that we could start looking at it beyond just how many grants are there and how many papers are there for each grant. So we started to look for a tool that could take us beyond this. And we all really liked our studio and wished that we had more time to learn how to use it in an effective way. But we also had a student license to Tableau software. So we ended up using it to explore different ways of presenting our information in a more visually compelling way. We ended up putting our data into Tableau, which can take data from multiple spreadsheets and allows you to see all of your fields and drag them into the center. And then once they're there, you can use different ways to visualize your data quickly and see, well, sort of quickly, there we go, to see if there's a way that's better than another way of presenting this information in a compelling and storytelling way. But as other people have mentioned, you have to be really careful not to be seduced by this kind of thing, because even though it looks great, it looks right, you see a picture and you think, well, gee, the data behind it must be right. But it's not always. So you always have to look at what you're getting back and say, no papers in Boston? There should be papers in Boston. So you always have to constantly be asking and questioning the data that you're getting back and the results that you're getting back. Tableau also lets you customize this not only in layout, but in colors, legends. It's pretty easy to manipulate to make something. And then once you get all of these different, it looks like Excel a little bit, doesn't it? Once you get all of these different worksheets, you can combine them into one big dashboard. They call it a dashboard. So you can understand it, you can see it, but again, you can look and say, you can question some of the data that you're getting here, and if you need to, it lets you go underneath and look at the actual information so that you can quickly check and see, well, why am I getting that weird result? Are there any zip codes in Boston? So again, it's back and forth and back and forth. And you can see here, I left this so you can see it. They'll also show you how many unknown things you have. It means maybe a field was blank or they couldn't understand what was in it. So that's really nice to know, but you also have the option to leave it out, which is sort of deceptive. And I think when people look at these visuals, they have to remember to ask and to think about what's underneath it. You can also show the data, but at a default position, which in Tableau ends up being just off the coast of Africa. They put a big circle there, so it's kind of out of the way, but you don't see it. You can also go in and you can look at your problems and you can try and resolve them right there. So I found it a really handy tool and an easy to use tool. Also between the dashboard, which is the grouping of this information, and the worksheets themselves, you can correct one and it will automatically sync and correct the other one. So I thought that there were some really interesting things about this tool. You can resort it, you can do different kinds of things to it. And I thought that was really helpful. And for us then, what we were starting to get into, and we kind of ran out of time. If we'd had more time, we would have done more. You can use this because you can take information from various sources. You can create worksheets that you can then combine to compare. So here I'm accessing both a NASA data sheet and a DOE data sheet, and I'm looking at the information in the same way so that I can see if there are any comparisons. Like, for example, the word clouds on the top come from keywords, which are a little iffy because not everything has a keyword and keywords come from different places, so it's not as standardized, but the one on the left is NASA and the one on the right is DOE. So you can see that there are differences in the kinds of subjects, and maybe that's a superficial kind of thing, but I don't know, I thought it was interesting. So could we do more? Absolutely. We had limited time. We were learning and applying new concepts and technologies. We all had different operating systems. We had a lot of fun trying to just install everything on everyone's machines at the same time. So will we use this in our lives, in our work? Absolutely. We're not IT professionals, but we're full-time librarians. We have an affinity for technology. We have a love and passion for information. And these are tools that we can use in our daily life to ask new questions and communicate the answers in an interesting and compelling way. And you can do this, really.
Question?
Well, she asked me before she presented, she said, you better ask questions.
I said you will probably ask.
So my question is, so you have the data from the grant sources. Would it also be from a different angle? You know how papers and publications, when they publish, when they're sponsored by the grant, they will have the acknowledgement section. Have you thought about using the acknowledgement section as a way to sort of either cross-validate?
Well, that's actually where most of the data is coming from.
Oh,
We
okay.
did check, the DST API will give you a highlights result that will show you the context for where it's coming from. And it seems to be mostly in the acknowledgements. It's usually not the abstract, it's usually in the full text or in a footnote or something. And we looked at these a lot when we were trying to figure out why we were getting all these false positives for the Department of Energy stuff. One thing that I want to do more with is use regular expressions and things like that to analyze the highlights more, because seeing the context for where they're mentioned and like the words that are around them would help us to validate like whether we're getting wrong information. With the NASA stuff, it was pretty clear cut. With the other stuff, less so. But I think it would be interesting to take like that. It gives you like a line of text, and it's enough to maybe get something out of. And if we did other searches on the full text based on that, we could probably get something more interesting as well.
And I'm interested in seeing where these things are. Is there some pattern for where they're always listed, or is it all over the place?
I'm just wondering how helpful it is, because you showed that visualization where you listed by state is interesting, but also by journal.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we showed the top journals for the papers and which are refereed and which are not. And again, we were using that tableau to ask questions and just kind of mess around and see what we could match up with what and what might be an interesting question. So we could do unlimited things with that.
And some of the questions we were asking, we didn't really think of until we started visualizing it.
A week ago.
Yeah, so we ran these queries that took forever, and then we ended up having to do stuff in like OpenRefine to take some things that were lists and turn them into usable.
There was a
data.
lot of cleaning up of the spreadsheets that we were getting. Trying to parse it out and Google refine.
I'm just wondering whether one grant project will tend to publish in the same journal or a variety of journals.
Yeah, that would be an interesting question.
Thanks. Oh, there's another question.
Wait.
Sorry.
I was just wondering about the keyword tag clouds. Were those the raw keywords or were they normalized?
They were raw keywords, and I have to confess that we did the word clouds in Wordle, because Wordle is much nicer and does better visualizations than Tableau does, or at least to my very low level of knowledge. So we just grabbed them from Wordle, and I didn't normalize them. I just put everything in that I could grab from the spreadsheet. And then I took a picture.
Thanks, guys. Yeah. So one thing that we wanted to do is, I don't know, is actually